Last week we went through the valley of humiliation, in which he met with Apollyon. So Christian got to fight with Apollyon. We saw the darts of temptation coming at him, and he had to stand fast against this assault that's coming upon him. And he did well until the devil figured out how to get a hold of him, flipped him over, almost had him down on the ground, started monologuing, and then he grabbed the sword and he ran it through him, and that pushed Apollyon away. Okay? This week, we're going to go through a different challenge. Now, there are times where you go through a trial, and then there's a time of refreshment, and then you go through another trial, and so on. In this case, Bunyan's picturing the idea that you're going from one trial to another trial right away. And there's very, very little time in between. So you're just kind of pushing it through, which kind of fits. When you're talking about the valley of humiliation, what is God trying to do but kind of keep you down longer than you think is possible? Because if it goes past what you think is possible, then what's left? The impossible. And and that's what we have to come to terms, that God is more than we can conceive of, that He is everything that we need. And when we have to get past ourselves, that's when we start to trust in Him. Does that make sense? So there's a beauty to it, that Christian's going to go straight from the valley of the shadow of death, straight from the valley of humiliation into the valley of the shadow of death. He gets this brief time where it kind of helps him to, remember, he kind of restores them and gets them ready for the journey, but he's ushered right into a new trial, and that's the valley of the shadow of death. Now, the big difference that we're going to find between these two trials is the nature of the attack. So tell me some of the things about Apollyon. How was that? What did that look like? What kind of stood out in your mind? How was Christian attacked by Apollyon? Yeah. And what else? What was he like? What did he want?
He wanted to bring Christian back into slavery, basically.
Good. He wanted him back into slavery. And what are some of the tactics that he used? Ultimately, yeah, he went right at him, right? If you're not going to agree, then I'm just going to destroy you. But he also... What's that? Bribery. I'll give you everything in this world, because it's all mine for you to give, right? What else did he try?
Everybody else died.
Everybody else does it too. And then there's the distrust, remember? How many of these martyrs did God come and save, right? While me, through power or fraud, have saved all the people that I love, right? So he's got all those things that he tried. But what was important about that trial was Christian was looking right at Apollyon the whole time, right? He knew where that trial was coming from. He knew what the challenge was. It was right in front of him. And Apollyon wanted Christian to focus directly on him. Forget the Lord, look at me, trust me, follow me. That was the nature of that challenge. And Christian had to stand firm, and he had to pull out his shield, and he had to pull out his sword, and he had to fight this new battle. Well, that's where the valley of the shadow of death switches everything around. The ultimate goal of the valley of the shadow of death is to get Christian to give up. Okay? Which was exactly what Apollyon was trying to do, right? But the nature of the challenge is completely different. When we left Christian last time, he started walking again, but this time he had a sword at his hand. Well, the sword's only good if you're going to actually have something to fight. And this is what the valley of the shadow of death is all about. It's really tough. It's labeled after Jeremiah's 2:6, where he starts talking about this loneliness that he's in. Okay, it's an internal loneliness. It could be because of an illness. It really could be literally that you're sitting on your deathbed, you're sick, you're down, whatever it is. The point is that you're feeling very, very alone, and there's nothing really close to you. You're feeling very cut off from the world. Okay, that's the valley of the shadow of death. Apollyon was difficult, but you could see him. The valley of the shadow of death, there's nothing. You're by yourself, but you know there's something, but you can't really tell what it is. It's dark, it's scary, it's unknown. Does that make sense? You can't see very far in front of you, and that inability to see is really the unnerving thing about this trial. It's the idea that when you when I was going to college, I remembered I was going to go to college. Okay, I've got it all figured out. I've been accepted. I've got everything figured out. But the problem is, in my mind, I couldn't picture what it was going to be like. I'd never done it before. There's a lot of things in life where I know they're coming and I know they're going to happen, but I can't imagine what they're going to be like. And to a degree, that kind of generates a fear of what will it be like. I just don't know. Right? Having your first kid. What happened for you parents when you first found out that your wife was pregnant with your first kid? Wasn't that kind of cool and kind of scary at the same time? Because what did you picture parenting was going to be like? Well, you saw it with your parents, and you saw it with your friends, and you saw it with this people and that people. But what did it look like for you? Well, you just didn't know because you've never done it before. Well, that's kind of like where Christian's going now into this valley. Spurgeon describes it this way. Get the idea of a narrow ravine, something like the gorge of Gondo, I have no idea what that is, or some other stern pass upon the higher Alps where the rocks seem piled to heaven and the sunlight is seen above as through a narrow rift. Troubles are sometimes heaped on one another, pile on pile, and the road is a dreary pass through which the pilgrim on his journey to heaven has to wend his way. Set before your mind's eye a valley shut in with stupendous rocks that seem to meet overhead, a narrowing pass, dark as midnight itself. Through this valley or rocky ravine, the heavenly footman has to follow the path appointed for him in the eternal purpose of the infinite mind. Through such a dreary rift, many a child of God is making his way at this moment, and to him I speak. Okay? So there's a dryness. There's a fear. Everywhere you go around you is just walls, and you got to keep going. And that's all you got to see. You can't see anything else. You just know you got to take your next step. Okay? Does that make sense?
Jason, you mentioned dryness. So is there like a spiritual dryness,
Mm-hmm.
like the sense that God's not there?
Yep. Yeah. So as we go through it, you'll see it. And that's going to be the biggest challenge, right? Will you take that next step when that's maybe all you can see? Make sense? So then I saw in my dream that when Christian was got to the borders of the shadow of death, there met him two men, children of them that had brought an evil report of the good land, making haste to go back, to whom Christian spake. Now, children of them that brought an evil report of the good land. Right? Do you remember where that's from? Who remembers? The spies that
were going to take out Canaan before they moved into the wilderness.
Right. And what did they do?
10 of them came back and were afraid there's giants, the cities are walled, we can't do it, we're going to be killed and they're going to take our wives and children this way.
Good. Now, what was the nature of their fear? Because two of them didn't have that, remember?
They didn't trust God.
They didn't trust God because
They were afraid.
giants, walls.
You only saw what man could do.
Yes. That was the key difference, right? They saw what they saw, and their perception of the situation was all that they had. That's all that they trusted. They didn't link what they saw with what God said. They just saw what they saw, and that was all that determined their opinion and reality. There was nothing more to their thinking. Does that make sense? That's a big deal. That's why Israel was condemned for listening to them. Because that's all they saw, was just what they wanted to see. Nothing more. Okay? Except for Caleb and Joshua. Okay, moving on. Christians, so these guys are coming now. They're coming back. They're going the wrong direction. Always bad news. Christian, whither are you going? They said, back, and we would have you to do so too if either life or peace is prized by you. Why? What's the matter? Said Christian. Matter, said they. We are going that way as you are going, and went as far as we durst. And indeed, we are almost past coming back, for had we gone a little further, we had not been here to bring the news to thee. Now, that's important, because what did they just profess to be doing previously?
Traveling the same path that Christians.
Yeah. And how much further?
A little further.
A little further. Now, think about what Christians met with. What does that tell you that these men have met with?
Worse than what Christian was facing right now, and it was already bad.
Yeah. They've already either met with Apollyon and got past him, They've dealt with the hill difficulty. They've met with all these other challenges that they've gone through. They're in the valley of humiliation. What does that tell you about these professing men that are now going backwards?
You come through a lot. They aren't just the spring soldiers.
Yeah. They didn't just show up. They didn't just come to church one Sunday and then disappear. These are guys that look like on the surface, they were battle tested. They stood firm. They fought Apollyon. Okay? Now that kind of matters, because there are a number of people that will stand firm against an enemy, that will stand firm against temptation, that will play the part. They will stand for righteousness and morality. They don't mind being pro-lifers and everything else and all the right, quote unquote, right, Christian right kind of positions. But that's the nature of this valley. The nature of this valley is not about whether you know what's right. The nature of this valley is whether you will cling to, whether you will have faith in what's right, what you believe, what God has said, what God has promised, even in the midst of a spiritual dryness, even in the midst of a time where things just are difficult to see. When God doesn't feel close, when all the world around you, like Spurgeon said, are big rocky cliffs that seem to go all the way up and there's no way out but forward, will you continue to go? Will you trust God in the unknown? That's one of the great dividers in the Christian faith. When you get to the unknown, when it's not fun anymore, when it's not surrounded by people that you like and approve of, when you walk into church and you're not seeing all this wonderful, happy feelings that you always had before, when God's providence is not delivering all the promised blessings and harps and gold roads and wings and sitting on clouds and all that kind of stuff doesn't seem to be real, when touched by an angel you find out it's actually false, what will you do? What will you follow? When you find out that your favorite Christian hero falls away from the faith, when you find out that the music you've been listening to is by a woman who decides to chuck it, right? Do you follow when everything else just seems to be falling apart? And for these men, of course, the answer is no. They're going the wrong direction. And so they say, well, we're lucky to get out of there alive. I mean, we went a little bit further than you. We've been through everything for you. And then we went a little further and we found out that's just too much. It's just too fearful. It's too much. So we're going backwards. And so Christian says, well, what did you meet with? Why, we were almost in the valley of the shadow of death. But that, by good hap, we looked before us and saw the danger before we came to it. So we looked forward and we figured out what we were getting ourselves into and turned around. Okay, that's important. But what did you see? See the valley itself, which is dark as pitch. Okay, that means you can't see anything. We also saw there the hobgoblins, satyrs, and dragons of the pit. We heard also in that valley a continual howling and yelling as of people under unutterable misery, who there sat bound in affliction and irons, and over that valley hangs the discouraging clouds of confusion. Death also doth always spread his wings over it. In a word, it is of every whit dreadful, being utterly without order. Then said Christian, I perceive not yet by what you have said, but this is my way to the desired haven. Okay, so what do you notice the first problem they have in their description?
They said that they'd been further and saw something and then described
What they saw?
circumstance, what they saw, which was nothing.
Well, but it was something, you think, right? What does their description have issues with? What does the first two sentences seem to be problematic? They looked at the valley and it was
Pitch.
dark as pitch. And then we saw satyrs and hobgoblins and everything else. Well, hold on.
Right? You can't be both.
Yeah, well, it's either too dark to see anything or you saw something. You've got issues, right, with one or the other. Yeah, potentially. It was the flames from the dragons, right? Now, this is kind of interesting. Hobgoblins, satyrs, and dragons. Has anyone heard of those before? Yeah. They are, what do you know about these creatures, for those of you that know anything about them? They're mythical, meaning what?
They're in our minds.
Yeah, they're imaginary. Okay, so what did these guys actually see? They didn't go into the valley, right? They just said we didn't go into the valley. We just looked ahead and we saw what we were afraid of and decided to go backwards, right? So did they go into the valley? Well, no, they didn't. But they said it was dark as pitch. Well, that makes sense. You could see that from a distance. But then you said you saw these creatures. Well, wait a second. I thought you said it was dark, and yet there's all these creatures. And what creatures did you see? Well, all these creatures of our imagination. All these creatures of our imagination. And then they heard these utter noises, these people screaming in fear and misery and trials. So are they lying?
Well, if you define lying as intentional, probably not.
Right. Are they purposely lying? Are they trying to find something wrong with this valley? Potentially not. What are they seeing? What did the men see when they went and sought out Canaan?
Their fears realized.
Right. They saw something, and then they combined it with their fears. Right? And what they were reporting on, what they came back to Israel, was not the truth. It was their mind's perception. It was their own fears realized and described and given as fact. And so these men are now coming to Christian and saying, here's what we saw. When we looked into the unknown, when we looked forward into things that we can't predict, when we looked forward into the things that we don't understand, we were afraid. And how does that fear manifest itself? Well, for these guys, it's satyrs and hobgoblins and dragons and noises and everything else. When you have kids and they get scared, you get all kinds of crazy dreams and all kinds of crazy descriptions, right? Because what they're seeing are monsters in the closet, monsters under the bed. They see all kinds of things that are, aren't real, but there's some of their fears kind of manifesting themselves in their imagination. So that's what these men are seeing. What they're describing is, it's scary. So scary that we decided to turn back. We just couldn't deal with it. It was too fearful. It was too fearsome. It was too much for us to take. It was too much for us to desire to go on. But now here's the problem. And this is Christian's first... there's some other quotes too, if we don't have time to go through them. But here's Christian's first test of the valley. Who do you trust? Who do you trust? The valley of the shadow of death comes up with one test. Will you continue to move forward when you don't know what's in front of you? Here's all the evidence saying you should turn back, and yet here's Christian saying, I've got to move forward. Because what did he say? This is the way to my desired haven. Now, what does that tell you about Christian? Two things that he just realized.
He's got a goal that overcomes the darkness.
Well, we haven't got there yet. But what does he know? He's got a goal. And to get to that goal, what does he have to do? That part he knows very well, right? He'll find out that his goal will get him through the darkness. Okay? You're good. You've already got the lesson. So, but we're going to walk through it anyways. But it's important to understand. When he looks at this goal, he says, to get to where I want to go, I've got to get through this. God has laid out this path. I do not have a choice. I can't look for alternatives. This is the way I've got to go. So there's a determination. There's a holy determination that reveals Christian's heart. Make sense? What else?
Here's the place he's going to is a haven. It's better than
Yeah. Yep. What else?
Is there a greater perception now than before? People told him to go somewhere or go here. He didn't really perceive it, but he followed their direction. Now he's perceiving the direction.
Yeah, that's it, right? This path is forward. There is no alternative paths. Whereas before he was told and he went off sideways, and he'll do it again by his own accord soon enough. But in this case, he knows he's got to go forward. So number one, he's got a goal that's going to make him go forward. But what about this path? It is God's path. This is a sovereignly designed trial. There is no mistake. He didn't take a wrong turn somewhere. This is exactly where God wants him to go. This is exactly the situation he has to walk through. Does that make it, is that comforting? A little. Is it especially challenging to your theology?
Yep.
It should be. Are you trying to tell me that God, as a perfect Father, wants me to walk through the valley of the shadow of death? Think about that name for a second. Does that even strike some fear into you? And yet God's designed it so that I will walk through it. In his wisdom and his goodness, he wants me to walk through this difficult path. There's both a comfort and kind of a, wow, what are you doing? Where are you leading me to? What is going on with this? Okay? If it doesn't, you got to re-examine your theology. You're not being honest with yourself. It is hard to see that God is taking you through these kind of trials. They are difficult. They will stretch you beyond your limit. Okay? And that's exactly what Christians are going to find. You have to have room in your theology for God to take you beyond what you understand. If you think you've understood it, you haven't gone through the valley yet. That's the whole point of the valley. God will take you through these things, and they will be hard, and they will be challenging, and they will be scary, and you won't know the outcome. You're not supposed to know the outcome. That's the whole challenge of the valley. Okay? All right.
Probably also hard is looking at shadow. It's very close to whatever it's,
Mm-hmm.
So shadow of death is very close to death.
Yeah. You ever played that game on your phone where it gives you the shadow of things, and you have to try to you have to move them around to try to create the shadow. It's the other way around. But basically, you look at a shadow, and it can be anything you want it to be, right? You can do the little butterfly thing with your hand, and it looks like a butterfly in the shadow, but it's really just your hands. So if you're in the shadow of death, it looks like the real thing, but man, it is hard to make out what it really is, right? All right. The man said, "Be it thy way, we choose ours." So they parted, and Christian went on his way, but still with his sword drawn in his hand, for fear he should be assaulted. That's good. He learned a lesson last time. "I saw that in my dream, so far as this valley reached, there was on the right hand a very deep ditch. That ditch is into which the blind have led the blind in all ages, and have both there miserably perished. Again, behold, on the left hand there was a very dangerous quag, I'm not sure, into which, if even a good man falls, he can find no bottom for his foot to stand on. Into that quag King David did once fall, and had no doubt therein been smothered, had not he that is able plucked him out." Now, that's a lot of words, but here's the idea. Christian decides to go forward. He has his sword drawn, which is great, except for it's not going to do him any good. So he goes then in a dream, so far as the valley reached. There was on the right hand a very deep ditch, and on the left hand is there's a swamp. Okay, he's got quicksand on the left, and a ditch on the right. Okay, so look at this. Let's think about this for a second. On the right is a ditch where the blind have led the blind. Okay, that's taken from Jesus' own words in Matthew, where he talks about leave them alone. The blind will lead the blind, and they will both perish. Now, what does that metaphor mean? It's talking about the Pharisees. What is the blind leading the blind?
Well, the Pharisees thought that they had it all figured out.
Good.
And they were trying to tell other people the right way to go.
Okay.
But since they themselves were blind, it was as useless as having a blind person and a blind person. There's no way that they can know what's ahead.
Good. So there's two characters, right? There is the blind leaders, and then there's the blind followers. It takes two, right? So when Jesus is condemning the Pharisees, who else is he condemning? Anyone that decides to follow their path, right? The blind leading the blind. Now, that's almost a comical scene, because what's going to happen when the blind lead the blind? Yeah, they're going to go all over the place and nowhere, right? And eventually they're going to fall off a cliff because they can't see it coming. And yet one's leading, and nobody knows exactly where they're going, but they're all following him anyways, and they're all going to go off the cliff together. So this is the same idea. The blind here are going to lead the blind into this ditch. Now, it's important to understand the context, because the blind leading the blind does have a leader and followers. There is some organization. There is some hierarchy. The idea with the Pharisees was that they are religious leaders that know exactly what they're doing. And here's what they've told me to do. And they said I should do this, so I'm going to do this. The blind, who have no idea why they're making the rules, but they make them anyways, leading the blind, who have no idea why I'm following the rules, but I'm following them anyways because he said so. So you have the blind leaders leading this blind, self-made religion, and they're leading them all into a ditch where they're never going to come back out of. So on the right side, what would you have? What is Bunyan pointing at as Christians walking this path by faith? What's on the right side of his path?
Well, the wrong kind of faith and tradition and rules and
Right.
formulas.
Exactly. Legalistic, self-made, man-made, self-righteous religion. Rules. I got to make rules, not faith rules. We make rules for ourselves. We have certain things that we follow to be able to try to be faithful. This is rules that demonstrate I'm righteous. Does that make sense? There's a big difference between personal discipline and self-righteousness. Okay? So on the right side is self-righteousness. Now on the left is this quag, or it's a quicksand or a swamp or something where you get in and then you're just going to keep sucked down and you won't be able to get out. Okay? Now this is one that King David did once fall into and had no doubt been smothered had he that is able not plucked him out. So this one's harder. What is on the left side? On the right side is self-made righteousness.
Is it license where you're just doing whatever you want?
Good. And how it happened to David? How does this link to David? What? Bathsheba? Keep going.
Well, he saw her. He was supposed to go to war, but he didn't. And so he saw her bathing, and then he took her, and then found out that he got her pregnant. And so then he brought Uriah back, and then
Right.
tried to. And then
So-
when Uriah was being honorable, he killed him.
Yeah. So let's kind of list all of this. Laziness. In the summer when kings go to war, David decided to chill out on his veranda. Then he's looking around and he sees a naked woman. Then he invites her over and commits adultery. Then he has an illegitimate child. And then he commits murder to be able to cover it up. Okay? That's a lot. That's a lot for it. I'm trying to figure out the timeline of this thing. Like, it's got to be over a few weeks. I mean, David's life just comes crashing down, right? So what's happening? His license, his liberty, his own. So if this is self-righteousness, this is taking too much liberty. So you have two ends of a spectrum, right? One is I'm going to be really rules-based. I'm going to work this all out. Over here, it's going to be I'm just going to go with whatever feels right. I'm going to do whatever I'm allowed to do. I'm going to go ahead and make myself feel good. So you've got these two ends where David fell into, and he would have just kept tumbling and tumbling. You can kind of see the snowball rolling, right? It's almost the expression, first rule of getting out of a hole is to put down the shovel, right? So that's the idea. David just kept piling and piling, and it wasn't until Nathan came and pulled him out. Now, were there consequences? Absolutely. But God came and pulled him out and set him back onto solid ground, forgiving him of his sin, not forgiving him of his consequences, forgiving him of his sin. Okay, and so this is the path that Christians got to walk. As he's walking in this dark valley that's dark as pitch, all these scary noises, walls everywhere else. He can't see anything else. Everything's in shadow. And now on this side, he's got a ditch that he'll never come out of. Over here's got a swamp that'll suck him in, and he's got this little path on which he's got to walk. Now, how do you think he's going to walk when it's dark and you have two life-ending situations on either side? Very slowly and very straight, carefully, right? One foot in front of the other, then you're testing the ground to make sure it's solid. Then you go to the next one, right? How fast is he going?
Really slow.
Yeah, which when you're in the valley of the shadow of death and everything's dark around you and you're having to walk with each step incredibly slow, what does that make the trial? Really long and very tiring and very tedious, and nothing is going your way. You see the emotional state that this is starting to take you through. Okay? The pathway was here also exceedingly narrow, and therefore a good Christian was more put to it. For when he sought in the dark to shun the ditch on one hand, he was ready to tip over into the mire on the other. And when he sought to escape the mire without great carefulness, he would be ready to fall into the ditch. So you can kind of just see him kind of like, oh, and pulling back over here, and then kind of leaning over this way, right, and trying to get his balance back. Thus he went on, and I heard him here sigh bitterly. For besides the dangers mentioned above, the pathway here was so dark that oft times when he lifted his foot to set forward, he knew not where or upon what he should set it next. So you see this description of just how dark and how scary and how unknown this is. When these men that turned back, ran back, here's the problem with what they said. We don't know which of them were actually accurate. It wasn't devoid of facts. It was just hard to figure out what was true and what was not, and to what degree. See, that's the scary part. When Christian heard this testimony from them, they weren't wrong. Not entirely. And so as Christian's going through this is what he's seeing. It's dark, it's scary, it's unknown, and he doesn't know what to do about it. Okay, I really got to pick up the pace. All right, about the midst of this valley, I perceived the mouth of hell to be, and it stood also hard by the wayside. Now thought Christian, what shall I do? And ever and anon the flame and smoke would come out in such abundance, with sparks and hideous noises, things that cared not for Christian's sword, as it did Apollyon before, that he was forced to put up his sword and betake himself to another weapon called all prayer. So he cried in my hearing, O Lord, I beseech thee, deliver my soul. Thus he went on a great while, yet still the flames would be reaching towards him. Also he heard doleful noises and rushings to and fro, so that sometimes he thought he should be torn in pieces or trodden down like mire in the streets. All right, so he's walking carefully, and what happens? What is he starting to feel? Yeah, he's starting to feel it. Now think about this. He's in this valley where every step he has to take is scrutinized. And he doesn't know, and he's afraid of falling into this way or falling into this way. So what's going to happen to his conduct? What is he going to think about in his own conduct? How quickly he can screw up. What if I fail in this valley? What if I mess up? What's going to happen if I don't make it through this valley? And what is he feeling like it's going to happen?
Kind of feels like in the moment he's going to be overcome.
He's going to be overcome, and then where is he going to end up? Because that's where he is, right? Apparently I can feel the heat of hell, so if I fall off this path, where's my next step going to take me? Straight there, right? Now look at these descriptions. The flames are coming out. They were hideous. And then nothing that his sword is doing nothing for him. There's nothing for him to strike and beat down and beat back, right? So what does that tell you about what's around him? What? It's abstract, and it's not close. It's all in the distance, okay? Sparks, hideous noises. He put it up. The flames are reaching out to him. He heard doleful noises, rushings to and fro, and he thought that he might be torn into pieces. Now, how many things have touched him? Nothing. So what's happening to him? Where is his fear? All in his head. Is there something there? Probably. Is any of that even coming close to actually touching him? Well, he doesn't really know, but so far, no, right? His sword's right there. He could swing it a couple times and he wouldn't hit anything. He doesn't see it. It's not there. It's in his head. The things that he doesn't know are made magnified by his imagination. But he doesn't use his sword anymore. What does he do? He puts away his sword and he refers to all prayer, because what does he need the most right now? He doesn't need his own strength. Does he even need God's strength? What does he need?
Stronger faith.
Faith. What does he need? Why does he call out to God? Peace, right? Deliverance.
To help his unbelief.
To help his unbelief. He needs the presence of God with him right now. This is a valley of loneliness. This is a valley where I don't know if I'm going to make it through. Lord, give me your assurance that you're with me. Does that make sense?
So his focus, it's kind of like Peter walking on the water. His focus is all these things that are
right
about hell instead of focusing on.
Right. Exactly. That's a great summary, right? He can see everything else but the Lord. And everything else seems much more real to him than God. But he doesn't give up. That's the key thing. He calls out in prayer to the Lord. I beseech thee. This frightful scene was seen, and these dreadful noises were heard by him for several miles altogether. So, why several miles? What does that tell you? Very simply. Long time. If you're having to take each step like this to figure out where you're going next, and you got to go several miles like that, that's a long, long time. Okay? And coming to a place where he thought he heard a company of fiends coming toward him to meet him, he stopped and began to muse what he had best to do. Sometimes he had half a thought to go back, and then again he thought he might be halfway through the valley. He remembered also how he had already vanquished many a danger, and the danger of going back might be much more than to go forward. So he resolved to go on. Yet the fiends seemed to come nearer and nearer, but when they were come even almost at him, he cried out with the most vehement voice, I will walk in the strength of the Lord God. So they gave back, and they came no further. So he continues on, and for the most part, you can see what's going on. He continues to move forward, even though it's getting frightening. But what's starting to creep into his mind? This is being important for the next section. What's he starting to muse upon? Turning back.
But only half a thought.
Half a thought. Why?
Well, because his faith is growing.
Because he's a Christian.
He's starting to overcome his fear.
Exactly. So there is an idea that God will complete what he started.
Right.
There is no doubt Christian will make it through this valley. Not because of him, but because of God. God will make sure he gets through this valley. But in Christian's own mind, he's starting to wonder, should I go back? Should I start to move forward? Okay, I'm going to move forward. I've got to keep moving forward. There's a holy determination within Christian to continue to move forward, even though it's still frightening, even though he's still scared. But nonetheless, there is that idea of wavering. And this is where you've got to get to. Every trial will get you to this point where you're ready to give up. And when you're ready to give up, that's when God comes in. And now you've learned what he wants you to learn. Okay, so here he goes. He's faced with his decision, but he calls out these men, these whatever they are coming at him, gives back. Ken Poole says, if the valley of the shadow of death teaches us an important lesson about the Christian life, it is possible for believers who are following the way and walking according to God's will to go through dark and difficult days, that may go through times, even seasons of severe oppression and trial. The valley can be long. Christian plods on for several miles and is disconsolate for some considerable time. How are we to follow Christ when the days are dark and we are so confounded and perplexed we don't know what to do? In those times we must not look to our own strength and understanding. We must walk as Christian, praying always and pressing on in the strength of the Lord. As we walk by faith, trusting in the promises of God's word, we will be encouraged. And though we may not see it, in God's kindness, our perseverance might be an encouragement to others to press on as well. One thing I would not let slip, I took notice that poor Christian was so confounded that he didn't know his own voice. And that's important, okay? He's starting to get so caught up in his head that it's almost like he can't figure out what's real and what's not. What's of him versus what's being pressed upon him, okay? And he did not, and thus I perceived it, that just when he was come over against the mouth of the burning pit, one of the wicked ones got behind him and stepped up softly to him and whisperingly suggested many grievous blasphemies to him, which he, Christian, verily thought had proceeded from his own mind. Now, that's a weird situation, and I think what Bunyan's picturing is a pastoral situation that he's seen multiple times. Christian is so stuck in his trial that he's starting to figure out, and then he's starting to doubt, and he can't figure out whether those doubts are of him or what. And all of a sudden, Satan or a demon or whatever, in Satan's scheming, something's whispered in his ear. Some kind of blasphemy, some kind of ungodly thought. So think about it this way. I tried to picture it in my own life. It'd be the idea that you're kind of frustrated, you're confounded, I don't know exactly what to do, I'm kind of stuck in my own head, and all of a sudden, advertisement comes up. Right? And it shows you something that you weren't expecting. It is something where somebody, you hear a gossip, and now all of a sudden there's a thought rolling around in your head. Now, did you go out to seek those things? No, that's the important thing. Christian was not looking for temptation. Christian did not put himself into dangerous situations. Okay? It was something that came upon him. It was Satan's schemes whispering into his ear. Okay, that's a big difference. If you go and sin and now you've got a bad thought in your head, that's a completely different situation. This is something where you were doing your best, you're struggling, you have doubts, but you're not going out looking for problems. They find you. Okay, that's an important situation. And so Bunyan's saying, this is what's happened to Christian. He's starting to look at things and he's so worried about himself that now everything, even things that are pushed upon him, he's starting to take ownership of. So this book, Christian, more to it than anything he had met with before, even to think that he should now blaspheme him that he loved so much before. Yet if he could have helped it, he would not have done it. But he had not the discretion either to stop his ears or to know from whence these blasphemies came. So he's singled out, he's by himself, he's depressed, and this thought starts rolling around his head. And this makes him even more depressed than he was before, because he starts thinking, how could I even entertain this thought? Okay? Now this is important. Bunyan says he doesn't have the discretion to stop his ears or to realize whence it came. So in Bunyan's opinion, Christian's lacking the maturity to know what are actually his own sins versus or what are other people's sins that he has to deal with. Okay? There's a maturity to it to know what I beat myself up about and what I don't. When have I sinned and when have I not? Okay? It's really, at least at our church and kind of in the Reformed tradition, there's a desire to kind of beat myself, and whip myself for being such a sinner. And I'm always a sinner, and all I think about is being a sinner. Okay, that's true. But do you really realize what the nature of your sin is? Do you understand who you are and where your sin is coming from? Do you understand when you're not sinning? Do you have the maturity to look at yourself and realize when you've screwed up and when you haven't? When you're just in a bad place? Do you know your heart well enough to know that you love the Lord? And I would that's not me. That makes sense, especially when you go out into the world. If you go to work, there's a lot of things that I end up having to be around that I didn't want any part of. But nonetheless, these are my coworkers. I have to work with them. When they start making those kind of jokes, I'll put up with it for a little while, hoping it blows over, but then I have to leave. It's not because I wanted to hear those jokes, but yet for that moment, I had to hear the garbage. Does that make sense? I didn't ask for it. I'm not participating in it. And if it continues, I'm going to move on, because I don't want to be a part of it. But I got to live in the world. And for that moment, I have to deal with this. Does that make sense? It's like watching an advertisement, watching the Super Bowl show. How long do I have to wait until the guy takes off his shirt? That wasn't really much of a temptation for me, but I would imagine if I was a female, that might be a temptation. And then I listen to the middle guy sing, and I don't understand a word he says. But I'm putting up with this halftime show because it's the Super Bowl, and I want to watch the Super Bowl, right? So the idea just being that I'm going to live with this, not because I want to participate in it, but because I've got to live with this world. And then to pull out of this world would mean pulling out of this world altogether, right? So there's a difference between tolerance and dealing with stuff and actually participating in it. And that's where Bunyan wants, there's a maturity to a believer. And the fact that Christian doesn't have this maturity and can't tell what he believes and what he doesn't believe, what he's committed and what he hasn't committed, is making his trial that much worse. Okay? All right. When Christian had traveled in this disconsolate condition some considerable time, he thought he heard the voice of a man as going before him, so further ahead, saying, "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Thou art with me." That's from Psalm 23. Then he, Christian, was glad, and for these reasons. So what did he just hear?
Somebody saying a Bible verse.
Somebody saying a Bible verse. Keep going.
He heard, and in the midst of all this,
Fear, darkness.
Darkness, scary surroundings, he hears someone saying the truth.
He hears the truth from somebody else.
That's walked before him.
That's walked before him.
And it's encouraging.
It's encouraging. Where is this person?
In front of him.
But in
On the same path.
the same path. They're in the same situation. They're dealing with all the same fear and darkness and everything else. And he's calling out now. Is this person before him? Are they calling to him?
No.
What are they saying? They're just fighting the battle themselves. They're just doing their own thing, trying to get through their own struggle. They're trying to fight the same battle before him. And yet, as they do so, as they voice their perseverance, as they voice their testimony, as they continue to march forward, their testimony and their walk is an inspiration to somebody else in the same place. Not intentionally, but because God would have it that way. Okay? So he was happy. First, because he gathered from thence that some who feared God were in this valley as himself. Nothing breaks loneliness like a friend. Secondly, for that he perceived God was with them, though in the dark and dismal state. And why not, thought he, with me? Though by reason of the impediment that attends this place, I cannot perceive it. So Christian's trying to realize, well, wait a second. Maybe if by virtue of the truth that he just heard, maybe God is here. Maybe it's just hard to see him. Not that he's not here, it's just hard to see him. Wow, he's figuring it out. Thirdly, for that he hoped he could overtake them and have company and fellowship. So the idea being that now he's starting to take his eyes off his own navel. Right? He's starting to up and look around. Even if God had been with him, he's so caught up in his own head, he wouldn't have ever seen it. Now he finally does. So he went on and called to him that was before, but he knew not what to answer. For that he also thought himself to be alone. So this other guy thought he was just hearing things, and so he doesn't respond. And by the day broke, and then Christian, he hath turned the shadow of death into the morning. So he hears this, he realizes that God is with him even in this valley, and what does that do to his surroundings?
Calms his spirit, and thus his fear of his spirit.
Right. And now all of a sudden the sun rises and the day breaks. Now that's important, right? Because now all of a sudden he can see. All of a sudden there's heat. All of a sudden there's light. All of a sudden the things around him are visible. They're no longer shadows. Okay? Now, morning being come, he looked back, not out of a desire to return, but to see by the light of day what hazards he had gone through in the dark. Does that make sense, what he just did? Have you ever done that, where you have a trial, and you look back on the trial not because you want to go through it again, but because you want to see what God brought you through? It's to meditate upon the trials and difficulties that you've had to go through in life. It should add to your testimony. If you never look back, you'll never learn anything. So you look back and say, what did God bring me through? How hard was that trial? I don't want to ever go through it again, but I do want to remember what God taught me, how faithful God was, and all the things that happened. Okay? So he saw more perfectly the ditch that was on one hand and the quag that was on the other, and how narrow the way was betwixt them both. Also now he saw the hobgoblins and the satyrs and the dragons of the pit, but all afar off. For after break of day they came not nigh, yet they were discovered to him according to that which is written, He discovereth deep things out of darkness, and bringeth out to light the shadow of death. Now was Christian much affected with his deliverance from all the dangers of his solitary way, which dangers, though he feared them more before, yet he saw them more clearly now, because the light of the day made them conspicuous to him. And about this time the sun was rising, and this was another mercy to Christian. For you must note that though the first valley of the shadow of death was dangerous, yet the second part which he was to go was, if possible, far more dangerous. So this is kind of important. The light breaks, and he now can see everything in front of him. Now, did the valley end? Nope. He's got to get through the rest of it. The trial isn't over. But what's the difference between the beginning of the valley and the end of the valley? You can see what's happening, which makes it real, less fearful. What can he do now? Anticipate. Move faster. What else?
You can walk with more confidence. He doesn't have to walk, one step at a time.
Right.
And also, because he can see around him, he doesn't have to fear that some hobgoblin is going to jump him.
Yeah, so he's not worried about what's going to jump him. He can anticipate. He can start to plan out his way so he moves a little faster. He can start to figure out what he wants to avoid. He figures out new strategies. You see that the light makes the trial that much easier. When you're thinking about how to get through this, it doesn't necessarily make the trial easy, it does make it easier. It makes it possible. Because the light of God's word, the light of God's presence, now makes all things possible. Sound like a Bible verse? Okay. For the place that he was now stood, even to the end of the valley, there was all the way set so full of snares, traps, gins, and nets here. A gin is another trap. And so full of pits, pitfalls, deep holes, and shelvings down there, that had it now been dark, if it were when he came the first part of the, as it were when he came the first part of the way, had he now at 1,000 souls, they would add in reason been cast away. But as I said, just now the sun was rising. Then said he, his candle shineth upon my head, and his light I walk through the darkness. Okay, so he's get through the valley. We don't have a ton of time, so we're going to speed through this next section. It is interesting. I just want to touch on it. We're not going to dwell on it for long. In this light, therefore, he came to the end of the valley. Now, I saw in my dream that at the end of this valley lay blood, bones, ashes, and mangled bodies of men, even of pilgrims that had gone this way formerly. Okay, so it's the scene of a massacre. Okay, if you want to look at it, if you want to make it a little bit humorous, you can think of Monty Python and the rabbit, the beast with... Okay, so there's all kinds of bones skewed around, okay? You can tell that this is not a good place, okay? And there are former pilgrims. And while I was musing what should be the reason, I espied a little before me a cave where two giants, Pope and Pagan, dwelt in old time, and by whose power and tyranny the men whose bones, ashes, blood, etc. lay there were cruelly put to death. Now, this is kind of interesting. So this is where I would say Bunyan's trapped in his own time and culture. Okay, especially in this section. So as he gets through, he sees these two giants. Now, what have these giants done? Well, they've obviously taken pilgrims, and they've destroyed them as they went along the way. Now, what are the two names of these giants? Pope, pagan. Okay. Now, for Bunyan, what did he have? What was his picture of the Pope? Remember, the Pope wasn't always the Pope in the sense that we see him today. But for Bunyan, what did he see when he saw the Pope? The 17th century version of the Pope looks like what? He's trying to squash what?
Real believers.
Okay, but you're reading too much into it. Give me more facts.
He had much more authority,
He had a lot of authority.
like an emperor.
He was more or less an emperor. What did the Pope tend to do? He interfered with international politics. He excommunicated nations that disagreed with him. He was trying to establish the hierarchy. This is the age of indulgences. This is St. Peter's Basilica. All that stuff is all happening at this time. So the Pope, in Bunyan's mind, was over the top, way too powerful for even an earthly ruler, much less an ecclesiastical ruler. He had a lot of power, and as the point was made, he wants to squash, not necessarily believers, he wants to squash Protestants. Okay? You can't make the delineation that all Catholics are non-believers. That's a bad assumption. He wants to get rid of Protestantism. Why does he want to get rid of Protestantism? A threat to his authority. Now, there's two reasons why, and this is where the idea of history becomes muddier, right? Politically, Protestantism was more than just a religious movement. Protestantism was also a very political movement. When we look at the Holy Roman Empire, one of the reasons why they rebelled against the emperor was because they didn't want the Pope getting involved with things. The Pope was a political figure, and so the rejection of the Pope was not just theological, it was political. This guy holds way too much power over our sovereign nation. And so they rejected him. That's why England rejected him. That's why so many nations started rejecting him, is because they didn't want him interfering with their national politics. So for a lot of political reasons, Protestantism was against Catholicism, specifically the Pope. Make sense? Theologically, if you look at the Pope, what did he and his cardinals and the church start to realize? And this is about 1,500 years of theology all wrapped up. The church has the right to determine the truth. Where do they get that from? First century, Ignatius and so on. They said that the church is the only one that has the right to interpret the scriptures. Well, if the church is the Catholic Church and he's the head of the Catholic Church, then who is the only one that has the right to interpret the scriptures? The Pope. And what was the main thrust of Protestantism? Everybody should read their Bible. Yeah, and there is no official language, And God reaches everyone. We don't need priests. We don't need prophets. Are they useful? Yes. Are they required? No. Everybody can read their Bible in their own native land. Now, do you see the problem with that? And then you start looking at all these pastors rising up, and they're given authority the same as a priest. And there is nothing to guide all these churches. Now, is that necessarily wrong? If I were to look at Protestantism, and we'll talk more about it next week when we talk about faithful, what was happening in England? For all their Protestantism, were they more Christian? They were Protestant. They were probably the definition of Protestantism. Were they more faithful as a nation? Were they more Christian as a nation? Were they full to the brim of true believers? They had Anabaptist, Baptist, Methodist, Ranters, Quakers. They had the gamut. They had the Church of England. And what did all these Protestant sects do? Argued about who was wrong and who was right, and who was always right. Yeah. So to a degree, did the Pope have a good reason to think this Protestantism is a mess?
Yeah, sure.
History is never quite that easy, is it? So, theologically or not, the Pope went after Protestants, Pilgrims, and he tore them apart. Now, pagan's a little bit more interesting. Who was pagan in Bunyan's mind? Not in our mind, in Bunyan's mind. The king. You say the king? Why?
Because he was another person that was in authority and didn't he pull away from the Pope simply because he wanted to divorce his wife? Is this the same king?
Well, that would be Henry VIII. That was about 100 years before. But it was a reason why they have the Church of England. Who's the head of the Church of England? The king. So probably not. He's a different problem.
Is pagan referring to paganism? Basically
Yes.
The thought that humans can manipulate gods through their
Good.
religious acts
Okay.
to get what they want.
And who would he have in mind in the 1600s?
You had the Muslims of the East.
Good.
You had the Native Americans of the West.
No. They were wiped out by then.
In England.
What's that?
The woes.
Yeah, not really.
Wasn't that really common in England?
By 17th century, the Druids and all the weird Anglo-Saxon stuff that's been driven out. And there were like Wiccans today. They're around, but that he would have had them thinking about it. But in his mind, what were the big ones? The Native Americans in the New World, and we have the Mohammedans on the right, on the east, and then you got the African nations over here. And what were they all? Paganism. They were all animism, a lot of those, and so on, right? So you've got Pope and pagan destroying pilgrims. Because what would happen to the Muslims? They would take them and they would destroy the pilgrims. They would be trapped by these paganism. And then if you go backwards, because if you read the Fox's Book of Martyrs, where did all the martyrdoms come from? Rome. And what did Rome have? A pagan system of religion. The barbarians that invaded Rome after the Rome fell, what did they have? They generally were ancestor or animal worship, as all the Picts and the Vikings, right? Odin and everybody else. And what would they do? Well, they would persecute true believers. So he's reading the Fox's Book of Martyrs, and what does he see? He sees these pagan religions that would kill pilgrims. So you got the Pope and you got pagan. That's in his head. Now keep going.
I have a question real quick. Is it killing pilgrims meaning converting them or
No, killing them.
causing them to, or just physically?
Well, yeah, recanting or killing them. And I have since learned that pagan has been dead many a day, and as for the other, though he be alive, he is, by reason of age, and also by the many shrewd brushes that he met with in his younger days, grown so crazy and stiff in his joints, that he can now do little more than sit in his cave's mouth, grinning at pilgrims as they go by, and biting his nails because he cannot come at them. First of all, that's kind of funny. But we look at this, and this is where Bunyan gets trapped in his culture. Okay, he says a pagan's been dead many a day. Why does he think that?
Way off, and you have to go to the end of the world to find paganism.
Right, because what's happening to Islam? It's being driven back. The Crusades went out and they pushed the Muslims out of the Middle East, out of Jerusalem.
But
For how long?
By Bunyan's day, they've already taken countdown, no?
True, but they're falling. So there's this golden age of Islam where they actually had a ton of power, and then now they're just starting to fall away. Okay, so this is their waning. Partly because the Christians are pushing back, and partly just because of internal strife. They're going to come back, and they're going to come back hard. Okay, in the East, or in the New World, what were we doing? We were sending over missionaries, and we're Christianizing all these new worlds. In Africa, we're Christianizing the African continent as we go and colonize all the European nations. So in his mind, he's seeing paganism dying out because the Christians are going after it. Was that short-sighted? Because what is New World, New Ageism? What are all these things that we don't call paganism? We'll call it different things, but they're all the same. Okay. Now the Pope is interesting. The Pope is still alive, but he just sits there grinning because he can't act. He tries to reach out, but he can't get him because he's so slow in age. Now that was also an interesting one, because did the Pope die out? Is he still around? 400 years later, does he still have power? Yeah, not the same kind of power, but he's still around. So I saw that Christian went on his way, yet at the sight of the old man that sat in the mouth of the cave, he could not tell what to think, especially because he spake to him, though he could not go after him, saying, "You will never mend till more of you be burned." But he held his peace, and set a good face on it, so went by, and catched no hurt. And then Christian saying, "O world of wonders, I can say no less, that I should be preserved in that distress, that I have met with here, O blessed be the hand from it hath delivered me. Dangers and darkness, devils, hell and sin did encompass me. While I this veil was in, yet snares and pits and traps and nets did lie my path about, that worthless, silly I might have been catched, entangled, and cast down. But since I live, let Jesus wear the crown." So, we don't have time to go through everything. Obviously, we're way over. But as far as Pope and pagan, just understand he's trapped in his culture. And that tells you a little bit about this work. It's not inspired. It's full of a lot of wisdom, but it's not inspired. But it's a brilliant look at how things really work. So that's a good kind of remember. But at the same time, just understand this is Bunyan going through a challenging time. Okay? And we're going to go through these. We're going to go through a lot of these, especially as you get older. And the world starts to lose its shine, and all of a sudden we're going to be more trapped in the difficulties and challenges and fears of life. So they're going to come up. So keep this one close. Next 2 weeks, we're going to go through Faithful. We're going to meet up with Faithful, the guy that actually called out the Bible verse. We're going to go meet him, and then we're going to spend about 2 weeks talking about his testimony. And it's interesting because we're going to talk a little about humanism, and we're going to talk about a lot of things, because Faithful is very different than Christian. And the things he's going to struggle with are fundamentally different than what Christians struggled with so far. So we're going to take a look at some different people, and hopefully different things that you guys can identify with. I did. You're going to identify with different trials and struggles and how he got over them. Okay? Any thoughts, questions? Sorry to keep you so long. It was a tough one. I knew we were going to be tight, but